Welcome to the King Talk podcast, where we're all about truth, community, and discussing the things you care about because we care about you. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Coleman. And today, man, we got the second installment of this segment we call Table Talks, where we have a panel discussion about the content our guests have brought to light in recent weeks. In case you missed the last one, our first Table Talk session, I would definitely encourage you to go check that out, man. It was fire, man. Definitely a dope discussion. This week, we're going to be discussing that Dr. Eric Mason interview. And actually, as a matter of fact, if you haven't heard that joint, man, you might want to go ahead and check that out, get caught up to speed. So that's what we're talking about here. But, back at the table with us today, we have the founder and president of King Movement, Chris Broussard. How's it going there, brother?
I'm great, my brother. How you doing, man?
Doing great, man. Doing great. Ready to chop it up about this Dr. Mason interview. But also, hey, on the line, we got my man, Cliff. Big Money Means at the table with us again. So how's it going there with you there, brother?
Hey, I'm good, man. Just another day, another dollar, like they say, man.
I feel you.
Oh, man.
You got to get another dollar. You got to make the first one first, man, in order to get another dollar, man. You got to get the first one first.
Hey, I'm working on it, man. Just out here maintaining. That's what they say. I'm out here maintaining.
That's two cliches in like 10 seconds, man.
You know, folks live on cliches, man. Folks live on cliches.
I will call
a
brother out.
Man.
I will call a brother out.
You gonna call him out, man?
For sure.
Old black men do not have conversations. They just give you cliches.
Hey, you know what? There's some truth to that, though. There is some truth to that. I've seen cats like in the barbershop, man. You see cats have a whole conversation with nothing but cliches, though, man.
Well, my grandfather, bless his soul, used to have the greatest cliches. How you doing, Grand? I called him Peepaw, believe it or not. How you doing, Peepaw? I'm kicking but not high. That was his best cliche. Wow. I'm kicking but not high.
Yo, what does that even mean?
It means I'm okay. I mean, I ain't dead. I'm kicking but not high.
Right.
You know,
exactly.
I'm running but not fast.
Right. I'm still here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Right,
kicking but not high.
I feel. All right, man. Well, let's go ahead and get into this Dr. Mason interview, man. So much to chew on with that interview. Some powerful stuff. One thing I definitely want to get into here, I'm gonna get y'all thoughts on it, man, because I thought he said some interesting things here. Dr. Mason mentioned that there are 3 dimensions of being woke. All right, he said number 1, aware of how you're perceived by whites. Number 2, how you perceive yourself, and then the third level, being awakened to how God perceives you and how you perceive Him. Now I'm gonna throw that out there to y'all. Matter of fact, I'm gonna come to you first, Chris. What would you say is the importance of being woke?
Well, first of all, I thought Dr. Mason did a tremendous job, dropped so many jewels of knowledge. It was just a pleasure to listen and learn from what he was saying. That also is my frat brother. Shout out to all the Noops and Kappa Alpha Psi. We got together in Philly and watched the Mayweather-McGregor fight together. So we were chilling. So
world family.
Yeah, I love my brother. All right. But I do have a little... I would disagree with the first, in my opinion, the first step to being woke. He said how you understanding how you're perceived by whites. I would say, in my opinion, the first step to being woke is understanding the true history of America and understanding the way in which white America has, and even before America existed, whites have systemically oppressed and discriminated against black people. Not only in America, but really throughout the world where they colonized Africans and people of African descent. So I feel like that's the first step to being woke, because that will give you a great perspective on what goes on today. So understanding the history of oppression of black people in this country and in this world for the last 400 or 500 years, and how that relates to our modern day. I think that is the first step to being woke. If you look at Malcolm X, he got woke, if you will, or we used to call it conscious, in prison. And the thing that woke him up, so to speak, was when he began to think about and be taught about the oppression that African Americans went through and still were undergoing, and how that related to his life. Like why he was separated from his mother, why his dad was killed by the Ku Klux Klan, why he was in the hood, and why like the white teacher that he had told him he had to be a carpenter. He couldn't be, I think it was an engineer, and why he ended up gravitating toward crime. And a lot of the African Americans he knew in his hood were gravitating toward crime. So the connection between the past and the present is what woke up Malcolm X. The same with me. Like I got woke, if you will, in college when I began taking Black Studies courses. I began even hip hop back then with Boogie Down Productions and Eric B. and Rakim and some of the other groups. It was more woke or conscious. Public Enemy, X-Clan. That is what woke me up, and I began to look at the plight of African American people as an adult, really, through adult eyes. And I looked at the state of our families. I looked at the state of our educational situation. I looked at, our economic situation. When you're not woke, you just look at, wow, we dominating football and basketball. We dominating popular culture with hip hop and R&B. We running things. I mean, really, that's the mindset of a person that's not woke. You think we're running things because we have the greatest entertainers and athletes. But in the grand scheme of what really enhances quality of life, what the family structure, education, economics, justice, basketball or football and, entertainment, music and comedy really don't mean much. So that's, in my opinion, that's the first step to being woke. The second step to being woke is, I agree with him, having an understanding of how you perceive yourself. And that is critical because the first step tells you why we're in the condition we're in as African Americans. And part of that condition is our perception of ourselves as Black people. And there is a lot of racial self-hatred in our communities. It might not be the individual having low self-esteem or hating himself, but it might be that individual thinking lesser of Black people as a whole. You understand what I'm saying? So, I mean, just a couple examples. These aren't any revelation, but good hair. We tend to think European hair, straight hair that's closer to being white is better than natural Black hair, or the dark skin, light skin, issues in the Black community, colorism, where a lot of Blacks think light skinned Blacks are better, better looking. And why? Just because they're closer to white, so a lot of us tend to have white beauty standards in our communities. So when you get woke, then you understand why Black people have those perceptions. Why? Because why do we say good hair? If you're not woke, you just grow up thinking good hair is hair that's like white people's. Or you grow up,
real talk, I feel you, but at the same time, like, I can't lie, man. 2016 was big for light-skinned folk, man. Y'all was winning last year, man. Between Steph Curry getting the championship, you know what I'm saying? Drake, did his thing against Meek Mills. I mean, y'all, light skin, I can't lie, man. Y'all got one up on us in 2016.
Nah, it ain't. I know you playing around, but it ain't even like that. You know what I'm saying? Because right. Black people, right. Black is Black. You know what I'm saying? And I feel you because, white Michael Jordan and Wesley Snipes took light-skinned brothers out of style. I get all that.
Right, right.
But and I joke around about Steph and Drake and Klay Thompson and Aaron Gordon, Zach LaVine. Yeah, we taking over again, whatever.
Yeah, you had to call all of them out, bro. I gave it to you. You went the extra mile.
Right. But in real talk, though, that's a serious problem in the Black community. Yeah. And it's related to our past oppression. It is not natural if you're a brown-skinned person to think that people that don't look like you are better looking. That's not natural.
Yeah, facts.
If you're a dark-skinned man and you refuse to date dark-skinned women, that's not natural. That's self-hatred. And you're looking in the mirror saying you won't date a person that's the same skin color as you. So that's self-perception is the second step to being woke, if you will. And so I agree with Dr. Mason on that, and we have to get rid of the colorism and the white beauty standards in our country. Yeah, there's beautiful and handsome white people, beautiful and handsome Asians and Hispanics, but there are also beautiful and handsome black people and dark-skinned black people. And, it's not based on your skin color. And so the third point, of course, I agree with the spirituality of what he was talking about, but to get to your real question of why is it important to be woke, I answered it a little bit in that little dialogue. It's important to be woke because you understand the current plight of black people. If you're not woke, meaning you don't understand African American history and African history, and you don't understand how it relates to your current times, then you will really you can honestly have a poor perception of black people. You can just look at the fact that we don't have the money that white people have. We don't have the family structure in 2017 that the white community has. We don't have the jobs, the educations that they have. And you can think, man, we just at the bottom. And you have no idea why. And you just think it's because you might just think that's the way it is. Or God made it that way. No, we're at the bottom because of 300 years of racial oppression and then some. And I don't want to go into all the, incidents and all the, occurrences of racism that have put us in this position. We may get to that later, but that is why it is important to be woke so that you understand the plight of our people. And you don't just think this is the way it is, or this is the way it's supposed to be, or this is the way it has to be, or black people are just naturally behind, naturally in the back. No, we have been put in this condition, because of systemic racism and because of the ills of, white Americans in the past and the way they've discriminated and oppressed against us. And so when you understand that, then you know that we're not inferior. You know that we're not, making less money because we're stupid or we're dumber or we're not in college as much because we're not as smart. You understand why. And that's why it's important to be woke.
I'm going to push back a little bit on some of that in a minute, but I'm going to go to Cliff first, man. I'm going to get your thoughts on it, bro.
Adam be pushing back, boy.
Push back. Push back.
I'm going to let Cliff play his hand first, then I'm going to get back at it,
Well, so I don't want to repeat everything Chris said, but piggybacking on that a little bit, I think, you've never seen somebody guarantee you, if you see a young African-American man, and he's acting a fool, chances are he doesn't know much about his own history. 99% of the time, he's not going to have any knowledge of his own history. He may know Martin Luther King, he may know Malcolm X, maybe Harriet Tubman, but outside of some of those major mainstream figures, he's not been educated about who he is, the achievements of African Americans. Chances are most of his self-worth and self-esteem has come from mainstream figures he's seen in pop culture, whether it be a LeBron James or, somebody in mainstream hip hop. That's where most of our young men get their sense of identity from. And so piggybacking on what Chris said about the importance of wokeness, I think learning your history gives you a sense of identity. And that's something that most young African Americans don't have, even despite your socioeconomic status. So there's a lot of whites in our country who, even though they may be even though they may be lower class economically, they have a strong sense of identity. For them, when you say America, when you talk about American history, they own that history. They own that to be their own. They self-identify with a country that's the strongest in the world. They're proud of their American history. So they hold themselves to the American standard. That is their standard because that's part of their identity. And that's something that most especially young urban men of color do not have. And it predisposes us to a lot of the ills that we do, because we end up in, because we don't have that standard. We don't have that cultural pride because we don't know our history. A second reason I think it's important for both lower class or low income, middle income, and upper class blacks to be woke. Because what happens is, if you're not woke, you have two groups. You end up with these two groups of black people in our communities. Those who are of a higher income status, or those who are privileged, they tend to major on individualism. So their perspective of the black community is largely based on their individual experience. So if they were able to go to college, if they were able to achieve a certain status that they see a lot of young African Americans not achieving, if they, didn't find themselves in prison, or didn't find themselves, in antisocial behavior, then they start talking down on black people. Black people do this. White people are not the only people who perpetuate white supremacy. Black people perpetuate white supremacy as well. And so, I think it's important that blacks of all income levels understand their history, because what you end up having is this split black community. So you have the low income or young black man who doesn't know his history. His self-esteem is low, so he's insecure about who he is. But then you have the black man who has been able to achieve, and because he doesn't know his history, he doesn't understand that the condition of the black man is largely due to systemic forces that have been in play. He credits his own individualism with where he is, and so he's self-righteous, right? So somebody is, on one hand, we got a bunch of folks who don't understand who they are, but then on the other hand, we have a lot of people who have a false sense of who they are. And I think that's why that third element that Dr. Mason talked about in terms of spirituality is important, because it balances out your self-view. You don't find yourself with a low self-worth, but you also don't find yourself with a high self-worth that goes beyond what it should be, where you use it as a weapon against your own people, because you understand yourself in light of who you are before God. And so I think all those elements are important aspects of being woke.
I would also, before I get the pushback from Adam, I would also say that it's important to be woke so that you can address some of the legitimate concerns of black people who, turn against Christianity, and they have legitimate questions about it, whether they're part of the black intelligentsia or they're part of the so-called conscious community. Like a lot of them think Christianity is a white man's religion. Well, if you're woke and you understand history, then you can easily rebut that point and really destroy that notion that Christianity is a white man's religion. Definitely, I think that's also why it's important to be woke, so that you can, engage our brothers and sisters who, turn away from Christianity because they have certain questions about it.
So let me throw this at y'all, man, and it's not going to be a lot of pushback, just a little bit, just a little tug, maybe, So within the last couple of years, I've become a dad. I've got 3 young, beautiful kids, man, and I think back to when I was a kid, my parents were real heavy on Black history. I mean, our household, we had to do book reports, on different Black figures and stuff like that. I mean, outside of what we learned in school. I mean, they were very serious about it. And I guess one thing that I grapple with is when I think about my children, I mean, thinking about the different levels of wokeness that Eric Mason put out there, being aware of how white people view you, being aware of how you view yourself. Like, honestly, I don't want my children growing up coming to understand themselves in light of white supremacy. You see what I'm saying? Like, I mean, it's a reality. We understand the historical context that we're in, but my struggle is do we sometimes teach our kids about themselves in such a way that we almost kind of like reiterate the message that the broader society is saying in the first place. Like, you're in this underprivileged position. You know what I mean? It's like we create them to be. I don't want to use the term victims because I feel like that's too strong.
Yeah,
but you see where I'm coming from.
I get where you're saying, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, and I was conscious. My daughters now are 19 years old, so they're in college. And yeah, I did not. I wanted to obviously root them in their blackness, but I didn't want them to feel like victims. I mean,
exactly, yeah.
And that is, you have to think about that. And it could be a fine line. In our house, we have Afrocentric art. You guys, Cliff, you've been to my house. You see, black paintings and everything all around the house. We celebrate Kwanzaa. We bought my girls, black dolls and brown skin dolls and stuff. Right. We read them books that dealt with. That were pro-black, not in a militant sense, but just, books that had depicted blacks in very positive ways. There was a book I remember that talked about the different shades and skin colors of black people and why that is. And we used to read all these books to them, as well as other books that were, didn't deal with color and stuff. But we felt it was very important to root our girls in their blackness and African heritage. But that said, I probably and we used to talk about, I remember I used to teach my girls about blacks in the Bibles and things in the Bible and things like that. And they grew up with a very healthy perception of themselves in terms of their race. I remember, in fact, one of their friends who was black, and let me preface this by saying God is not black, white, yellow.
Oh, Lord. Once you start prefacing, we know something coming. All right.
No, I mean, but God is beyond our human labels, you know what I mean, of race. I mean, God is beyond that. But, you ask a lot of white people and a lot of black people, what color is God? And a lot of them would say white, which is ridiculous because, again, God is beyond our human labels. But they were maybe 8 to 10 years old, somewhere in that range. And one of their black friends was saying to them that I guess they had been having a conversation, and she was saying tell them that God was white. And they were laughing at her. And so we were all in the car with their friend, and they told me, they were like, they said her name. I won't say her name, but they were like, she thinks God is white. They were laughing like, how could you think God is white? You know what I mean?
Right.
And that made me feel good because I don't want black children growing up thinking God is white, And again, he's beyond human labels. But imagine if you think God is white and you're black, what are you going to think about yourself? You know what I mean? So, but even with all of that, I probably, even though I talked to my daughters about race, I didn't have a conversation with them about race in which they really, I think, quote unquote, got it and, came back at me with good questions and really understood where I was coming from and could relate to it until late in their high school education. Like they were juniors and they actually went to a diversity, like it was a weekend that their school sponsored, where they went to like a diversity camp, for lack of a better word, and they discussed a lot of racial things. And when my daughter came back, that was when she was telling us about the camp and things they discussed and things they experienced and things that her eyes were opened up to. One of my daughters said it was life-changing. And at that day, we had our first conversation about race where she really understood it, and got it. And so I agree. As an 8-year-old, that's supposed to be a time of innocence, 10 years old. But at a certain point, they're going to get to an age where they can better process the racism, the white supremacy, the fact that, you know, society may judge them differently than their peers who are white because of their skin color. Just like with whether it's sexuality or whatever, even parts of, you know, religion, there are certain things your kids can't handle you wouldn't teach them at 5. You wouldn't teach them at 10, but you'll teach them at 15. You see what I'm saying? Or you teach them at 18. So I think that's the approach you use. But you're right, Adam. You don't want them growing up feeling like they're victims.
No, not at all, man. And honestly, in you know, not to belabor the point, but I think that this is why the third level that Dr. Mason mentioned was so powerful in terms of the component about how God perceives you and how you perceive him. Because this whole race concept, black, white, and everybody in between, that whole race concept is intricately linked with the concept of power. You see what I'm saying? As European colonizing powers moved into the West and then obviously brought black people over as slaves and you know, indigenous peoples who were already over here were enslaved and, you know, the land stolen, all that kind of stuff. Like your color was directly associated with where you stood in society. It's always been linked with power. And I feel like, you know, that third level of understanding who you are in God, how he perceives you, how you perceive him, it kind of gives you, it takes you out of that power scheme, that race-based power scheme, and gives you, in a sense, like a leg up, if that makes sense. You know, where you're not just a slave to, or just, you know, subject to this power scheme that is just, you know, imbued with society, man. You know, and I mean, does that make sense? I see you over there, Cliff. Like, I see you, you know, kind of nodding there. What do you think, man?
No, it secures your identity. I agree. I mean, I think, you know, it's important. I mean, when I hear at least what I heard from you before, you know, and not wanting to, I guess, give your children or your daughters an unhealthy view of the world. I guess what I heard you saying was, I don't want to perpetuate the system or you know, perpetuate it by teaching my daughters about white supremacy or teaching them to view the world through white supremacy. My only issue with that is it sounds a little bit like the colorblind argument, where, you know, you hear people say, and I just want you to clarify for me, because this is what I heard from you. Chris heard you say you don't want your daughters to be raised as victims. I heard you say that what I heard coming from you was, by teaching my daughters about this, I'm perpetuating its reality. And what I would say is, no, it's a reality regardless if you teach it or not. Exactly. You know, you're teaching them about something that actually exists, and you don't want them to be ignorant about it. And there's a difference between that and empowering them and letting them know who they truly are and the fallacy of the system, but not denying the system, because they have to be able to identify it when they see it, especially when you have vulnerable people who are being affected by it, and you don't want them to misunderstand the plight or position of those in the world because they don't understand the system that they live in. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I guess that's an excellent point. And I guess to clarify what I'm saying is, I don't want my children, my sons or daughters, to develop their self-concept based upon the black-white dynamic. And what I mean by that is there's a bigger world than the enmity and even the history, between black people and white people. There's a bigger world. And I want my children, their self-concept to be broader than that. Now, to your point, though, I feel what you're saying. Obviously, it's a reality. We can't raise them in a world where they just, they're oblivious to what's going on around them, because that can be, dangerous, obviously. Right. So, I hear what you're saying but I guess where I'm coming from is, I think that sometimes we, there's a bigger picture that we can help our children to see earlier on than sometimes that we do.
I would say that number one, your identity should be rooted in Christ. Absolutely. So that's number one. The spirituality is the most important. But as you said, you don't want your kids growing up, obsessed or smothered by the black-white dynamic, or as it is in America for sure.
Right.
And that's why I think African history is incredibly important. Not a lot of times we talk about black history and teaching our children and others black history, meaning African American history. But African American history begins in slavery. It begins at the bottom. And so if that's all you know, then that's a skewed view of the black reality or the black history. And so when you know African history, that is beyond the dynamic of black and white, because African history took place long before the Atlantic slave trade and long before white supremacy.
Sure.
It's important to teach, and I believe it's important for blacks as a whole, not just children, to understand the great black civilizations, or know that there were great black civilizations in Ethiopia, in Egypt, West Africa, Mali, Ghana, Songhai, all that before white supremacy, before slavery. And when you understand that our ancestors did great things in the past, then you see us being at the bottom, so to speak, today. You understand that's not the natural state of black people. And again, that history and African history is apart from white people. And so it's not just a response to white people. It's not just a response to oppression. It is black people doing their thing as black people, and that I think that's very important. Let me ask you this, Adam.
Okay.
Because you said your parents, really taught you a lot of black history as you were growing up. Right. Did you feel, because you're giving a little, you seem skeptical about raising your kids that way. How did you feel as a kid learning all that black history? And before you answer it, let me say this.
Sure.
Jewish people teach their kids about the oppression that Jews have undergone. And nobody ever pushes back on it. And it's not viewed as a negative. White Americans and all Americans learn about the so-called oppression or discrimination or whatever we got from Britain that made, America break away from Britain. No other groups teach about the oppression and they keep it moving and nobody looks at it as negative. But when we do it, a lot of times people blacks ourselves want to be like, oh man, just leave that in the past, or, let's move on, let's move forward. No, we need to understand the history, both in this country and before we brought to this country. But please answer my question.
Yeah, definitely. My experience was.
I don't know if that sounds correct.
Please answer.
Just
answer now, please. Thank you.
Back to use your word.
Right.
But now, man, my experience was a little bit different, man, because, I came up in a home where, we used to wear dashikis at church, man. Like, people wear dashikis at church. Like, it was a very Afrocentric environment. But that being said, I feel like, I'm in a somewhat different position. You know what I'm saying? I grew up in a 2-parent home. We didn't really, have a whole lot of drama like that, you know what I'm saying, in our neighborhood or anything like that. But now, looking at the last 8 years, you have a number of black men being killed, by police. You have a number of just racially charged issues that I don't feel like was really front and center when I was growing up.
Hold on.
I'm
going to push back.
Okay.
I believe
right.
that the number of unarmed black men being killed by police has lessened. I bet you when you were growing up, there were more unarmed black men being killed by police.
I don't disagree
with you.
Hold on,
let me finish. We just didn't have the iPhones, and we didn't have camera phones, so we could capture it. Think of all the instances we saw. Philando Castile. Back in the day, that would have been like, man, he pulled a gun out on me. And the cop would have had the last word. And we would have just thought, man, dude tried to shoot a cop and he got killed. You see what I'm saying? So I think that was happening way back then. And you as a kid, and also because we didn't have the social media that we have today, you just weren't aware of it.
There's some truth to that. And I'll even take it a step further, because for me, like Michael Brown was shot and killed right around the time where like my wife was pregnant with our first son. You know what I'm saying? And so as a black man, you know, as a father, you know, for some reason it was a little bit different, you know, when I had my daughter come along, but definitely having two sons now, you know, I feel like I definitely am more aware of the dynamic, and I think the challenges that are more apparent, you know, in society than they were when I was growing up. But again, I mean, to your point, it could be just I wasn't aware. I mean, we did have a Rodney King situation. We did have, you know, OJ and the white Bronco, but like, you know, stuff like that. It, like to me, it wasn't real. You know, it was just.
I mean, Chris, you older.
NWA was rapping about this stuff we see going on now, back in the 90s.
I mean, that's true,
Chris,
but at the same time, like for me, that was rap.
But
I mean, that was TV. It was entertainment.
Right.
But and admittedly, I didn't grow up, you know, in South Central or wherever it was they was at. You know what I'm saying? But now it's like, okay, it's not TV anymore. Now I see Tamir Rice really got shot within 2 seconds of the police getting on the scene. Like, you know, and that could be my son. You see what I'm saying? And so Chris, now it's like, wow, you know, I have to be more. It forced me to be more aware. I thought I was aware. I thought I was woke, you know, when I was like 12 years old, you know what I'm saying? But, you know, it's just with recent events, man, it's really just, you know, forced me to think more deeply about these things and how I can approach it. I don't want my kids to be fearful. I want them to grow up as champions. I want them to grow up as victors. But at the same time, I do want them to be aware that there are very real dangers and very real challenges out there, you know. And so I'm just kind of sorting it out as I go. Yeah, go ahead, man.
And to Adam's point, I mean, not to get too far off, but you know, Chris, there is a small little age gap between us. And I think, you know, me and Adam
that was a shot
probably,
right there. I think that was a shot.
Real small, man. Real small.
Yeah, a little something small.
Check yourself, bro. Check yourself.
You probably identify with what Dr. Mason said, you know, about a different world. That was y'all time. Y'all was in college when A Different World was on.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. You're right about that.
And y'all identified with the story.
And later.
But me and Adam are probably around a similar age, and for us, I think the most polarizing racial issue we experienced was OJ. And then after OJ, there was really nothing really going down until the Trayvon situation came up. Yeah, so there was a period where a lot of stuff was happening in the streets, but it wasn't in your face, like you said. And Trayvon really brought everything front and center, and it has been nonstop since then. Since 2012, it has been nonstop. And I thought it was, of course, it was alive and well, but racism was kind of lying dormant. And the election of Obama kind of got the wheels rolling a little bit. And then, boom, it busted wide open when Trayvon Martin's situation came about.
I would say that's part of, like, your explanation, and I understand where you're coming from. But I do think some of that thinking is part of one of the problems that we face as African Americans, or one of the obstacles that we have. Like, you mentioned overt forms of racism. Overt. And then you even said racism was dormant. Racism, it wasn't dormant.
I'm sorry.
Like,
I didn't mean it that way.
Yeah, I was going to say, we respond to these overt forms of racism, and we want to march, we want to complain, we want to all this stuff. But when there's not the overt forms, we tend to sit back like racism ain't existed. Well, no, they're still not teaching you true American history, or that includes black people in the classroom. You're still in the projects because of you see what I'm saying? Like, our reality is, you know, race. Like Lil Wayne, when he said about a year ago, he's never experienced racism. The reason you grew up where you grew up in poverty was because of racism. You know what I'm saying?
But that's why I prefaced and said it was happening, but it wasn't in our face. Those things, you know, Trayvon brought it forced the conversation, and sometimes you need the overt things to force the conversation, because people will ignore the subtle, you know, systemic things that are happening behind, quote unquote, behind the scenes.
Let me ask y'all this too, because this segues, I think, you know, real nice into something else that Dr. Mason said too, which I thought was pretty dope. We were talking about the emasculation of the church, right? And we were talking about, you know, manhood and just the decline of the male presence in church. And what he attributed it to was really what you guys are discussing now, like, you know, the community concerns, housing issues, whether it be, violence and, police brutality and all that. He dug into how, because the church is not addressing these things, on an ongoing basis, like, kind of to your point, Chris, folks aren't addressing it on an ongoing basis. It's almost like men don't have a place to fit in, in the church world, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. So I'm just kind of throw that out there. I mean, Cliff, you want to comment on that or?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and it was he called it a core, I believe he called it core cultural concerns. Mm-hmm. Yeah, core cultural concerns. I thought it was a great point, which is why, he talked about, them doing local marches in Memphis, and engaging their community. But I think it's important to point out that at one time, specifically speaking of the black church, for lack of a better term, we know the black church existed because it had to exist. So, but the black church at one time was a primary vehicle for black men to achieve social change at one time. And it was one of the few and probably only places where a black man could be respected as an authority, right? As an authoritative figure. Politics was closed to us. Mainstream society was closed to us overtly. And so the church was a place where we could go as black men, achieve positions that we could have positions of authority, and we could also state our political positions, mobilize people, and achieve social change. Well, as time went on and as the civil rights movement opened up the doors for black men to be able to diversify their options, now black men could go into mainstream politics and achieve change. Now black men could go into corporate America and achieve change. Now black men had the options to go and make millions of dollars through sports and these other avenues, acting. The mainstream society opened up. And what had happened was the church did not evolve. The church did not evolve with the changing opportunities that men were able to now go out and receive. And so now, instead of the church really maintaining its central mission of social change, it now became about book sales, the building fund, the church parking lot, sowing your seed and tithing, giving God your seed. That's what it became about. And now you have superstar preachers whose mission has just such a far cry from what it once was. I think had we evolved and stay in step with the change, men, bottom line, men were not slaves to the church anymore. They didn't need the church, and so the church had less of they had less leeway when they fell off the mark. Folks didn't have to wait on us any longer. So I think had we evolved and had we changed and had we developed and continued to stay focused on the main thing, I don't think we would have lost men, because, like Dr. Mason said, men want to make a difference in their communities. And that's one of the things that King is about. And we don't have a problem bringing in men, because we are very clear with men. We want to make a difference in the community. We want to speak to the issues that you are facing. We recognize that education, economics, and justice are issues that are important for change. And if you're not talking about those things, men ain't trying to hear it.
Yeah,
I thought you made some great points. And go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was I'm just bucking on everybody today, man. My bad, but I'm gonna slightly disagree with one thing that you said. Slightly disagree, is that I think that I don't know if it's so much that we didn't evolve. I mean, obviously we didn't, but I think a more fundamental issues is that I think the church wasn't operating the way it ought to have been in the first place. And what I mean by that is we in America and just in the Western world in general, we have a very institutional understanding of what the church is. You see what I'm saying? And I think that the church is actually, if you go back to the book of Acts, it's not about a building. It's not about an institution. It's about a community. You see what I'm saying? And so when we look at it from a community standpoint, it should never have been the case that like church is like this institution that, you know, funnels out to, you know, support to the community, and then hopefully they bring something back. It's, you know, within this community of believers, different people with different skill sets ought to be, you know, in communion with one another, such that the collective is benefited, if that makes sense. You see what I'm saying? So it's not so much that, you know, like we should have always been producing doctors, lawyers, and so on and so forth, but not that, you know, we don't just do it through, you know, chicken dinners and you know, scholarships, but that's just as a community of people, we ought to build that way. And I think that we view the church as being separate from like an extension of the community, rather than being a community in and of itself. And I think that's part of the problem.
Well, I think a lot of those go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I think
I said my piece.
To your point, you're addressing something that goes beyond race, because whatever the race, there are more women in church than men, not just in the black church. Now, it's exacerbated in the black church, but it also is an issue in the white church as well, having more women than men. And I think one of the things that causes that, to your point, Adam, is when you look in the New Testament, I mean, they met in houses. Right. Everybody participated. You see in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about everybody had a doctrine, everybody had a teaching, everybody had a psalm. You know, like everybody was participating, kind of like when we meet as the King movement and we have discussion. You know, it's Bible-centric or Christ-centered discussions. But there's a leader, i.e. pastor, but everybody gets to share, you know. And so if you study history, you'll see that with Catholicism in like the 4th century, and probably happened even a little before that, you had, quote unquote, that was the implementation, if you will, of the quote unquote professional Christian. And so then you began to have it more structured, more institutionalized, and one man was doing all the teaching and all the preaching, and the other men would just sit there and listen, and it became spectator Christianity. Men need to be active. We've all learned this from our work in men's ministry. Men want to be active. They want to be doing something. They want to be participating. And Christianity in America, and really, like you said, the Western world, as it's institutionalized, it can become a spectator sport. And so a lot of men lose interest. So that's one thing. Right. But getting back to the racial element, I think there's a couple things. One, I think the black church has been somewhat effeminized, and a lot of it is based on emotion. You know, you see some preachers that they're preaching just to get the people emotional, just to whip up a frenzy. And I get it. At times in the past, when we were facing severe oppression and you kind of wanted to give the people a release, you know, a physical release, an emotional release, a mental release, that was important, you know. But now we're not facing as severe oppression, and we're still just trying, sometimes in some churches, not all, maybe not even most, but playing to people's emotions. Men want practical training. Men want teaching. And if you look at a lot of churches, a lot of black churches that do have a lot of men, it tends to be more practical teaching about how the Bible applies to everyday life and how the Bible is going to get you through these obstacles and incidents you're going through, how it's going to teach you how to be a husband, teach you how to be a father, teach you how to deal with, you know, a negative situation or an employer that doesn't treat you right, you know. So that's one thing. And then secondly, if you look at a lot of the religious groups that have drawn black men, the Nation of Islam, the Black Hebrew Israelites, they address the identity issue of black men from an ethnic perspective. And there's nothing wrong with ethnicity. You know, ethnicity is very prominent in the Bible. I mean, the Bible always talks about different ethnic groups, okay? And so whereas the church has kind of got, most churches don't really address that. A lot, like I said, these other groups that draw black men do address that. And I'll give you one example of how important that can be to a lot of black boys and men, and even women and girls. A white friend of mine, he's a minister, I met at a conference. He adopted a black boy. And the boy is like, maybe at this point he might be 9 or 10 years old, maybe 9 years old. He said, he and his wife go out of their way to, teach the young boy black history and, have him, bring him to black events and museums and things like that. And one day they went to a black church, and the little boy was 6 years old at the time, 6 years old. And they're in a black church, and the boy was just having a good time. He was enjoying himself, and they could see it. And they said to him, "How do you feel?" And this 6-year-old black boy said, "I feel like I'm at home."
Wow.
Think about that, 6 years old.
Wow.
And he had already dealt with issues of race in his mind. And so if the church ignores those issues, if God, you're showing you got a white Jesus in your church that is obviously not historically accurate, and it's just a symbol of white supremacy. And we know, even a lot of white people know Jesus was not white, and yet we push this picture in front of our people, and then they already got questions about their identity, and another group, a Nation of Islam or whoever, begins to address those issues of identity from a racial standpoint. Right. And we're ignoring them. That can draw a lot of men to those groups and take them away from the church. And there is no reason for the church to shy away from addressing issues of racial identity. It's dealt with in the Bible. There's a rich African Christian heritage in America, but more importantly, perhaps in Africa, thousands of years before the Atlantic slave trade. And so I think that is another reason that a lot of black men aren't in church.
And Chris, some people may hear you say that Jesus seeing a white picture of Jesus is a picture of white supremacy, and they may say to themselves, why is he saying this? It doesn't matter what color Jesus is. And what we would simply say to that is, we agree. It doesn't matter, but why paint the picture white?
Exactly.
It's not historically accurate.
That's the
so
thing.
The fact that you altered it, the fact that you altered it to be white and not represent history accurately, that's why it's a symbol of white supremacy, not just because it's a white picture of Jesus, but because you're brainwashing people about what this historical figure did. And just one more point that I wanted to bring up. When you go back, especially because tithing, especially for black men, when they hear tithing, that's something that chases a lot of black men away from the church, because they see that as a hustle. They see that as a lot of pastors. You know how it is in our communities. Pastors taking the tithe, they're driving around the big cars, this, that, and the other. But when you look at the Old Testament, every third year they tithed. That tithe went toward the Levites, toward immigrants, strangers or foreigners, whatever you want to call it, orphans and widows.
Exactly.
Every third year. Now imagine if a church said every third year, all the tithes you bring here, we're going to put back into the community to build up the community. I bet you have men back in church.
No, that's
you understand?
That's a great point, man.
I bet you would see more men in church, but they cannot see the tangible effect of the money. Where's the money going other than building this big fancy building and parking lot and selling books? So that's why I think that's a major reason why brothers have retreated, because the money, look, as they say, put your money where your mouth is. You understand? Like, you know, if you're saying you care about black people, but the money is not going back into the community to build it up, man, people, they could see a hustle from a mile away. So, I mean, you know, that's important.
Yeah, man. I mean, no doubt about that. I mean, and to Chris's point too, you know, if you got a picture of Jesus that look like Colonel Sanders hanging up in your church right now, man, he got to go, man. White Jesus got to go.
We know better by now. Before, you may not know better.
He got to go.
But now you should know better by now.
It's got to go.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Information, like Dr. Mason said, information travels too fast now for you not to know better. You
know, back in like, you know, the early 1900s, you could let it slide. But I mean, people, you know, we know better now, man. He got to go. Hey, White Jesus had a good run.
Nah, it wasn't a good run though. It wasn't a good run because that was the run when we was in slavery and Jim Crow.
Right.
Nah, that wasn't no good run.
Well, yeah, right, yeah. Nah, that wasn't no good run.
You know, Chris don't play that. I mean, I thought it was, Chris, you can't even joke with Chris like that. Chris came up on that Public Enemy. You know what I'm saying? Like, Chris don't play that. He on that X-Clan. You know what I mean?
Nah, exactly. You always trying to make things light, man. This is serious conversation,
and Chris light skin on top of it. And you know light skin brothers be the most woke.
I came up on that real conscious
right.
music. Y'all think this stuff, Kendrick Lamar and J. Cole is conscious. I came up on KRS-One and Chuck D.
Could be that guy, maybe like, yo, why you wearing that white t-shirt, my brother? That white tee, my brother.
Nah, I ain't going that far.
I was going to keep going. I'm going to leave it alone. Well, that concludes the first hour of this session of Table Talks. Be sure to check in with us on the next episode of the King Talks podcast so you can catch the rest of this discussion as we get into a myriad of topics, including giving our perspectives on the well-known theologian that Dr. Mason mentioned, who calls himself a paleo-Confederate and has stated publicly that if the Civil War were happening today, he would fight for the Confederacy. Wow. So we definitely get into all that and break that down. In the meantime, make sure you slide over to iTunes and subscribe to the King Talks podcast. Give us 5 stars, leave a comment, and then spread the word about what you're getting here with the King Talks podcast. As always, to the King Talks family out there, till next time, strong in the Lord.